What do you think of when you think of New York City at war? Like what immediately comes to mind? Yeah.
I definitely think about the American Revolutionary War.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, I remember there's like a memorial in White Plains that's supposed to be either a memorial or a previous armory that was in use during 1776 during the actual Revolutionary War. So that's definitely what comes to mind first.
Fantastic. So going all the way back to kind of the beginning of America, there's this idea, the connection we know from its foundation, that New York City has had something special to do with a special role in the war. Yeah, excellent. Other thoughts? What comes to mind? Yeah.
My all sports in New York Harbor, and this was everywhere to work in Miami.
Yeah.
So that's one of the new things that comes to my mind. Because we were so sporting that time, I thought it was effective.
Fantastic. So memorials from going back to the Revolution, and then actual structures that are still standing. You could think maybe Castle Clinton that's down there by the Battery, or go out to Governor's Island. Some of these fortifications are still there. You could go out, you could walk on the ramparts, you could see the bits of it. The Intrepid out there museum now, right there with these kinds of monuments. What else? Yeah.
I think about 9/11. Sorry. Yeah, this was like the reason we went to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Right. A moment, the most recent of moments where war really touched the city's the city's streets. Fabulous. And of course, the memorial and museum exists today still.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot about the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
New York was in possession of the British for the bulk of the war.
Right.
So it wasn't, a lot of loyalists came here, escaped slaves came here, because the British would be more free than the Americans were not. And also, Manhattan was an almost impregnable fortress. If you think of Washington Heights, the Americans tried to attack Washington Heights multiple times to get some fortress back into Manhattan. It was very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until the French came that, we were able to kind of liberate Manhattan or get
Right.
New York back. Also during the Civil War, there were the New York City draft riots,
Mm-hmm.
probably the worst race riot in New York City history. And it's also been, I think, kind of like fundamental to the world wars as well. There were huge numbers of draftees here in World War II. It's not the locus of 9/11, et cetera. So I do think New York's been pretty central from amongst all the major wars for the United States.
Excellent. And I think you brought up a new avenue, I think, of inquiry to talk about, and that's the geography, right? Of the physical space. Part of the reason that New York is so essential in a war for American independence is that it sits right on the Hudson River, and it's an important logistical line of communication, resupply up north into other British colonies. And controlling the Hudson River becomes an important strategic goal for the war. So controlling New York and New York Harbor is part of the reason why it was so important to the British forces when they seized it, and why they maintained control of it. They'd hoped that it would really strangle colonial resistance. It didn't, of course, but that was part of the plan. So we've been talking about memorials. We've been talking about actual battle sites, geography. What else comes out? What other kind of residue do we get from the war? Place names, maybe, things like that. I've got something. I pulled up an old map here just to sort of think a little bit about how the war might have shaped the city from its earliest days. What are your thoughts about? Could everybody see this? I sent it out to, or I think Dave sent it out. I'm taking credit. And there might be some black and white copies too. This is a map showing New Amsterdam. So before the British controlled New York City, before it became New York, it was New Amsterdam. They might be Giants fans out there. What do you notice about the map? Am I in the way? Am I blocking the map? I can step aside for you. There should be a black and white copy. What jumps out at you? It's tiny. Yeah, absolutely. It's tiny. There wasn't much. There wasn't much here.
I keep thinking about Wall Street.
Yeah.
I also keep thinking about Hurricane Sandy for some reason. I don't know why. Well, I guess I do know why, because, we had this problem. How long ago was that? I think over 10, a decade.
Yeah, 20.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
12.
Yeah, 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and Wall Street here on the map,
Yeah.
you could see so named for the fortification, right on the northern edge of New Amsterdam. And so even in our kind of daily vocabulary, when we think about or talk about our city, the war creeps in ways that we might not even think about anymore. That that Wall Street wasn't always just the stomping ground of Gordon Gekko. It was before that. It was an actual wall, and that's what it was. It was there to try to protect the settlers from mostly from the indigenous population. The first recorded death in New York is that of John Coleman on the 6th of September, 1609. He was a crew member with Henry Hudson on the Half Moon. And as soon as Hudson began his kind of reconnoiter around what's now New York Harbor, he sent out a small craft to look at Manhattan. And it was met by a pair of boats, probably with Lenape people. The European sailors became frightened, attempted to light a match for a matchlock weapon. Apparently, as soon as they started trying to light this long match, it began raining. And then they were attacked by the oncoming indigenous warriors, and John Coleman was killed in the arrow. He's probably not the first person to die from war in New York, but he's the first sort of record that's still extant. So from its almost earliest settlement by the colonists, New York has been connected to warfare. That it's a part of this city's foundations, and remains in ways that are obvious, like 9/11 Memorial, and then ways that have sort of faded a bit into the background, like Wall Street, right? Which I think I think it's valuable to just think of it as a war memorial or whatever. It's time, the residue of a war at its time. Any other thoughts on this map? There's some of these street names are still there. You can see Beaver Street is on there, still so named.
Philadelphia was the biggest city in the colonies, and the geography of New York actually plays a huge role in New York becoming a commercial city. Because the Erie Canal, after the Erie Canal was built in particular, plus the natural harbor of New York, the city had this enormous economic boom. I mean, you could connect Chicago to the Atlantic Ocean, basically. And that shaped all their destinies, because New York, kind of between the securities trading on Wall Street that started in the late 1700s in the Erie Canal, they really made New York what it was as well. So geography.
For sure, yeah, different kind of security on Wall Street, right? You have in mind. If you go today, they have sort of the little marks where they think the Palisade used to stand, and then I think even by the stock exchange, there's a little timeline they've carved out too, where you can see where the people began trading what becomes stocks and whatnot in the vicinity of the financial center. Cool. I want to make a quick plug today. I've changed up things a little bit in part. Just to deference for the first day, I included in the readings a New York Times piece by Russell Shorto, but I messed up the printing of it, so it wasn't economical to print out. If you have a chance, I encourage you to look at it. Russell Shorto is a historian, and the article, if you have time, follows his own little walk through the city looking for Revolutionary War sites. And it's worth kind of spending a couple of moments with to think about kind of how he's approaching looking at this urban landscape and trying to glean from it sort of the residue of history, or I think maybe even more interestingly for our purposes, or more interesting, but interesting for our purposes, narrative history. He's interested in the people who were part of these events and who lived in these places, who lived in our city, who participated or survived the Revolutionary War in Shorto's case. And that's, I think, part of our guiding, or one of our guiding themes for the next couple of weeks, to think about New Yorkers and the way New Yorkers have responded in writing to war. And I wanted to sort of really start things off, and I guess in depth by introducing Edith Wharton. And I want to spend the rest of our time, which should be about an hour good, talking about Edith Wharton. Does anyone know Edith Wharton? Yeah? What comes to mind? Yeah? House of Mirth? Ethan from?
The Age of Innocence.
Age of Innocence? Yeah, fantastic, right? So, Edith Wharton. Yeah. Terrific. Edith Wharton was born 1862 as Edith Jones on 14 West 23rd Street. Tomorrow morning, if you're interested, if you need a latte or something, it's a Starbucks now. I know, right? Isn't that it's like the saddest thing? You put it into Google Maps and you're like, what? It's like, oh. But Edith Wharton, born to New York society. So she's born into kind of that Gilded Age, old New York. By the age of 5, though, her family was living abroad. And this kind of becomes a story of Wharton's life. She spends her entire life kind of crisscrossing the Atlantic. She's in New York, she's back in Europe, she's back in New York, she's back in Europe. This is for, too many times, I think, for well, a biographer has counted. I was unable to keep track of, but she's very much a cosmopolitan, and was from the earliest age. She grew up intensely interested in literature. By the age of 15, her first translation had been published already. So she just grows up eager to do this. Her mother, though, forbids the reading of novels in her house until she's married. Right. Well, but some bad novels out there. But Edith Wharton agrees, and as apparently, allegedly, doesn't read any novels until she would get married. She's engaged immediately at age 18, and has a 2-year engagement that's broken off by her fiance, who found her to be, quote, too much of an ambitious authoress. Right? So already it's, which I love, because it just says something about who Edith Wharton is. She drives off one fiance. She eventually marries in 1885, so by the time she's 23, she marries Wharton, becomes Edith Wharton formally. Her husband is absolutely terrible. He spends most of his time either in New York and Boston, embezzling money from her, selling her property behind her back. He does pay her back, much of it, but he needs to keep his mistress in a life to which she'd become accustomed, and just kind of fleeces Edith Wharton for her own money. By 1913, she would eventually sue for divorce on the basis of adultery, and it was granted. So she casts him off to the dustbin of history and moves on. By 1914, July of 1914, she's in Paris, 3 days before the outbreak of war between France and Germany. Almost immediately, she begins relief work. And it becomes a passion of hers during the war years. In 1915, she visits the front at the Argonne and at Verdun, makes numerous hospital visits, and starts using these experiences to raise awareness of the plight or the suffering of people affected by the war in the United States by writing for journals and raising money from society for relief causes. And she begins investing a considerable amount of her own money, so much so that she begins to undergo severe financial strain, and she's almost broke by 1916. She's invested so much of her own money into it. In 1916, she edits the first book of the homeless, she called it. So if you had a chance to look at writing a war story, the kind of journal that appears in this story, she edited something very, very similar. Though she did all the translations herself, because she's a person of boundless talent. It ends up being tremendously successful. It continues to raise funds, and it brings some relief to her financial straits as well. She'll continue writing more just to support herself during the rest of the war. But by 1919, which is after the war, the year that writing a war story first appeared in Women's Home Companion, she'd been cabled from an editor that said, quote, "War books are dead in America." By 1919, these stories are starting to fall out of fashion. But as we know, Edith Wharton will continue writing. She was eventually awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1921. Prize that was awarded to her over Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, allegedly owing to the objection of the trustees of Columbia University, who objected to the content of Main Street and had Sinclair Lewis sidelined and gave the award to Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton was furious when she found out and wrote to Sinclair Lewis about the issue. This may in fact be part of the reason why she is always too ill to receive an honorary Doctor of Letters from Columbia. She rejected offers to receive a degree in 1930, 1931, and 1934 from Columbia. She did receive an honorary Doctor of Letters from Yale in 1923, though. So she'd sort of been there and done that. I guess that was the thing. But the question of whether or not she sort of held it out against Columbia the timing's suggestive. Her work was hugely successful in her lifetime. She was one of the first authors to have multiple films adapted from her work while in her lifetime. 7 film adaptations came out of Wharton's work during her lifetime. She had nothing to do with any of it. She seems to have no interest in sort of how her work was adapted for screen. But starting in 1923 and then from then on to the end of her life, there's seven of her books are made into are adapted for the screen. Others were adapted for the stage. So an incredibly popular writer, and a writer associated intimately with New York. Right? And this goes back to her own sort of upbringing in New York society, her interest in New York, its people, the weird social pressures that come from being in places like this. And I think much of that is lurking in this story that I want to look at today. Writing a war story. Has anyone read this before? See this short story before? Okay, well, before Shorto? All right, cool. We won't have time to read the whole thing, I think, in our meeting, because I want to spend more time talking. But I want to sort of break it into a couple of chunks that we could focus on. So what I'll propose to do, with a little sense of sort of what's going on in Wharton's life now behind us, I'd like to just dive in and spend like the next, 10 minutes or so and look over the first 4 pages of this. So from 247, which is the first page that's there, to 251. We'll read down to "She began to hate her inspiration," which is right before that paragraph break. Let's take like 10 minutes or so and just read over these pages, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about what is going on with Edith Wharton. What's this war story going to be all about? And see where we might go. So I've got I don't know, 8 after. You take like 10 minutes and read. Let's just start with some basic description. What are we reading? What's going on in these pages?
So Ivy Spang was like a really good American author.
Yeah.
And she was asked to write a story about World War I pretty much. And she's just like in her room, just like drawing from inspiration.
Oh yes, yeah, exactly. We're going to come to that. Oh, she's got such a vexed relationship with her inspiration. It's fantastic. Yes, so we're going to come to that. Right. So Ivy Spang, she's getting ready to write. She's getting ready to write a war story. What should it be like? This war story.
The Hollywood production.
Oh yeah, kind of a Hollywood production. Let's say some. Could you say some more? What do you mean? What do you mean by Hollywood production?
Well, as is common with Wharton writing, she has a very sardonic, sharp edge to it.
So
She's
great.
making fun of people.
Oh yeah.
She's making fun of Ivy Spang. She's making fun of the guy who's doing the literary thing. And the great line here is, so nothing in particular resulted from this tribute to her genius. You know,
Fantastic.
kind of a classic.
End of the second paragraph on the first page.
But I think in all her writing, she kind of takes a little bit of a jaundiced eye, of sharp edge
Yeah.
to what she's observing.
Absolutely.
It's important for the story to hold.
Absolutely. Oh, I couldn't agree more. So let's look for some more examples of this. What specifically this war? What should this war story be like? What do you think? According to the, yeah.
Well, in 248, there's the whole recipe.
Yeah. Oh.
Starting with a good rousing story. First of all, it should be rousing.
Of course.
Should have a little bit sentimental, not depressing. A tragedy with a happy ending. All the way down, to the end where it gets even more like a recipe. Stirring a trench story. It has to have a coming home scene, like you were saying, Hollywood. It's an exact recipe based on this, I guess, editor, the Pale Man's idea of what a story should be, or the publisher's idea of what will be published.
Okay. So it's a war story that's a tragedy with a happy ending, right? A good stirring trench story with a coming home scene close to close with. A Christmas scene, right? You could feel the Hallmark Channel kind of lurking in the background. I mean, this is but why does it? What does this fit with your expectations of a war story? What should a war story be? Is this a good war? Is this a good recipe? I like that idea. It's a kind of the formula. It's all right here, right? A trench story. Is Spang. Does it fit with your expectations?
I feel like especially how we are exposed to war stories nowadays, we typically start with the boot camp scenario, like they learn how to become soldiers and then off to war. A bunch of action scenes show up and then at the end they are triumphant, waving the flag or either coming home. We're used to like a certain pattern that is leading towards a good and happy ending always. And one thing that really stood out to me was on page 249, where we kind of go through her internal thinking of what does it actually mean to write a war story? What is a war story? Why do we always start at the beginning or the end? Can we start in the middle? And especially because during the time period that she's being asked to write about the story, they're 2 years into the war, so they kind of are at the middle of the war story, which is something I find really interesting about what she thinks about it and what she inevitably starts to write about.
That's fantastic, and I like already how you are talking about these expectations we might have of a war story. It's certainly that feel like they're working in the back here. This idea of something that's triumphant, that's going to be the arc. But then Wharton finds a way to skewer that and make it seem ridiculous with the sort of the layered sentiment that's so kind of thick and palpable. Let's talk about this moment on 249, where you're directing our attention. Just where do you begin? But how do you write a war story? What's Ivy's problem? She's an author, yeah.
Well, yes, I'm glad you point out 249 because I find her first 2 pages frustrating. I think she is reflecting on how the writer that she's talking about reads the beginning of a story and gives up on it because it begins in such a poor way. And her own story, to me, was doing the same thing for me. And the whole thing didn't start until page 249 in the third paragraph. And I thought that was such a wonderful, insightful paragraph.
About the paragraph beginning moreover, or
It starts moreover. Yes.
right, moreover, the more she thought of the matter, the less she seemed to understand how a war story, or any story for that matter, was written. Why did stories ever begin, and why did they ever leave off? Life didn't. It just went on and on.
So I thought that was such a wonderful way to say something very important to any writer.
Okay, so there's something.
When you read it, for that matter as well.
Right. I think it's part of the magic of this story itself is how much of it is just Wharton's opportunity to talk about writing. I think it also is asking us the question of what's the difference between a war story and a story? I mean, is there? Or do we have different expectations? One or the other?
I think the other thing here is that neither Heidi nor this pale gentleman know anything about being a soldier. She's from New York Society, he's from some literary
Magazine.
somewhere.
But she's been you've been at the front. Here we are in 248, I suppose, right? Oh, that's capital.
Yeah, it's interesting. She also says, you know, then the war came and she forgot about writing poetry.
Right.
Right.
She's yeah.
She was at least near the front. Right?
So she's but you're bringing up a fantastic question about the role of experience, or do we have an expectation for a kind of experience? Is there a sort of authority that comes with experience that works its way into a war story that we'll find kind of layered ironically later in the when her story is published. But we could look too. I think back to the first page, the great moment to which you direct our attention. Then the war came, and she forgot all about writing poetry. And then the very next sentence: the war was 2 years old, and she had been pouring tea once a week for the whole winter in a big Anglo-American hospital in Paris. What's happening there? 2 years passed in that break on the page. Then the war came and she forgot all about writing poetry. Why? What do you think? Why forget all about writing poetry? Yeah.
I think part of writing poetry, or part of what can inspire you to write poetry, is a certain sense of general calm.
Okay.
Like, I remember learning about there being a sort of pyramid in which you're able to start thinking about different things. Like, first you have to take care of your basic needs, and then your emotional needs, and then you're able to start thinking about things in a metaphysical sense. And once a war starts, it kind of can seem a bit hypocritical, perhaps, or maybe not that word, but it seems out of place to start writing about poetry that doesn't surround or isn't completely made or created with the war in mind. And I don't think that the author necessarily was willing to use poetry in that sense. Like, I don't think she wanted to create war poetry. And so from that, she kind of took a break from poetry as a whole.
Okay, so this is Ivy, not Wharton. Yeah, because we have to peel back the layers of authors.
The way I read that part was that somehow poetry was less important than other things in life, and almost as if suggesting that it was a banal enterprise. And then there is in the subsequent pages the notion of writing fiction versus non-fiction, so as to create a hierarchy of the different types of writing.
And perhaps along with that, I think the different responses to the war in the sense of what you were saying, we were talking, the banality of it all, and her response to it, right? There's this sort of, the war came, she forgot all about poetry. Which makes perfect sense. The war is a very serious business. Maybe poetry is now being cast as something that one has the leisure to do, but no longer. And now she's just pouring tea. And it seems to trivialize what we know. Edith Wharton has profound experiences doing unimaginably good and important, influential work for war relief, right? But not Ivy. Ivy's reduced to just pouring tea, and it's part of what it's part of it's part of Wharton's humor, I think. But it does kind of I think complicate those.
And a clarifying question: is this a work of fiction or not, or is this person a real person that she's writing about?
So I don't know if Edith Wharton has an Ivy Spang in mind when she's writing this in real life, but this is a work of fiction, and that, though how much of it might be kind of culled from her own experience, I can't say, but certainly I think I don't know. Let's leave it there. I think there's work. This is clearly a work of fiction. Whether or not there is an actual Ivy or there was an actual Ivy out there that Wharton knew, I don't know. But a good question. I wonder how that might fit in our conversation though about direct experience with war, or maybe Wharton's experience with being in a hospital setting and fitting this. There was a hand in the back.
Yeah, I just think it highlights like the functions of literature at that time.
Cool.
I think at 251 it says she even asked for the switch to poetry, but he said there's no appetite for it, right? There's no, it is specifically story and deadlines, so perhaps it's also the audience, perhaps like the function of literature.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Cool. Yeah, so you're talking about deadlines. So like the second to last paragraph, I think is that what you?
Yes.
They already had rather more poetry than the first number could hold. Yeah, I love that. And that he included a reminder. He count. Okay.
As like the functionality in the business side of literature now, not so much as an art form, but really as a mechanism for someone else's like output. So I think that's interesting.
That's right. You signed up for a certain number of pages, Ivy. I need to push this copy. You can't give me a sonnet, the editors, because there's a commercial interest working here, which is fantastic. And I think it's important too that, and I'm thrilled you point this out. This is at the bottom of 251, shortly after the break, that we'd abandoned poetry on the first page, and then now when she's feeling a little unsure if she can get this story in and meet this arbitrary deadline, if she's going to go back to poetry, going to go back to something. Oh, can I send in a poem? No, we need a full short story. What do we make of Ivy as a reader? And then I want to move on to another portion of the story, but we don't get into too much. But she does some reading here. What is she reading? What's the role of reading in these first few pages? Yeah.
Well, I thought the reading of those two things she found on the beach were so that they were her models, perhaps. She was considering whether she should write like them, comparing her own writing to that.
Yeah. So she's interested in she's got writer's block. She's out walking on the beach, right? You can imagine she's desperate for something to start. It's just not happening. It's just not coming. So she goes for a stroll. She finds this literary magazine, just washed up, sitting on the beach, and she picks it up. She knew that inspirations were fussy and contrarious. This is on 249. She felt rather as if she were dragging along a reluctant dog on a string. She's so hard on herself, right? This idea that she just can't come up with the good war story. So she's seeking inspiration, right? But she's worried about, what is she worried about in reading too much? What's the worry here?
I think she seems conflicted because well, on the one hand, she mainly reads the very, very beginning, and she makes an opinion on that, on reading the first sentence, whether she's going to continue reading it or not. And then she is concerned that she may write like somebody else, and that she could get contagion over that the ideas have to be completely 100% coming from inside her.
Right.
And well, so I don't know if she actually reads anything completely there.
So, right, so she's just reading the beginnings. She says, okay, she's worried about influence. She's concerned about taking too much in from these other authors. So she's, I'll just read the beginnings. I'll just read the beginnings. I'll figure out how to start this. And then she writes this on 251. So she sat down, very top of 251, before the mauve paper and wrote, "A shot rang out." But just as she was appealing to her inspiration to suggest the next phrase, a horrible doubt assailed her, and she got up and turned to fact and fiction. Yes, it was just as she had feared. The last story in Fact and Fiction began. A shot rang out. She gazed down at the page which she had polluted with that silly sentence. Poor Ivy. She's struggling. She began to hate her inspiration, right? What's this central problem here? I think links back to this kind of this recurring theme we've been starting to tease out, and that's a question of Ivy's sort of self-imagined authority, right, as an author to write this story, and a question that we brought up just around this table that lurks behind the idea of the war story. Who gets to tell war stories? Who should or in what way can they? If you've read, we're going to skip ahead a little bit, but if you've read, if you had a chance to read it all before, whose story does she end up writing? What kind of story does she write?
She takes the governess's story, which is very different.
Right. Where does the governess get the story?
She gets it directly from the soldier. She met the soldier at the military hospital, and she essentially writes down the story.
Anil Durand, he's an alpine hunter, they're called, right? And he's a member of an elite French infantry unit that's trained for fighting in mountainous conditions. He's been wounded. He's in the hospital, and the governess meets him while helping him convalesce and writes down his story, right, as close to it as and accurately as she possibly can.
What also says her first notes in her copybook are, of course, she took this from home. So the question is who's more sophisticated, Ivy or governess?
Oh, okay, right. In relating this story.
Not only in relating the story, but just in thinking about literature, right?
Ah.
Is her poetry very good? I probably doubt it, right?
The editor of Zigzag gave it a positive review, but right, okay, good. So again, then whether it's sophistication or artfulness, the sense of how a war story ought to be written, by whom, and whether it's war literature or a war story, whether it's a transcription of kind of narrative of events or a piece of literature. Right, and what that might, literature itself becomes a key word in a bit. I want to skip ahead a little bit. If you haven't read the whole story yet, you could definitely put it on the nightstand because it's worth going through. But Ivy collaborates with the governess to turn this soldier's story into literature. I don't know, into a story, into a tragedy with a happy ending, right? Into something with a dash of sentiment that's suitable for this literary journal. And let's skip down to 255 and try. Yeah, we can go quick. Starting on 255, after it was not long before Christmas. Let's just kind of quickly try to read from there to the end if we can. We'll take another maybe 7 minutes. What happens with Ivy's story?
Well, finally it gets published, but
Huzzah!
nobody is actually taking it or her seriously, particularly the women. She's being, throughout whatever feedback and reactions she's getting from people are filling her with self-doubt. The person with the brain seems to be the governess. The only other woman in the story who's taking her at all seriously. And the kicker is, you know, at the end of, everybody just wants a photograph. So this rings pretty true today. You know, then the fact that it's about writing a war story, it could be a story about almost anything, because people are just not taking this woman seriously as a writer or anything else except somebody who can foretee.
Right. So it very much and written, or maybe I could follow up your comment with a question. What could we do with our sort of sense that we know Edith Wharton knows a good deal about war? We know that she has some tremendous practical experience with it. What's the story doing here? Why does it seem surprise, or is it unexpected that a woman is writing a story about a woman's war story failing in this way?
No, I think she is, she could easily, for any of her, maybe not her peers, any other woman, could have had the same treatment. And Edith Wharton did get taken seriously, but many of her contemporary, I can't say fellows because she's a woman, her contemporary female writers weren't.
So what starts off then as a short story about writing a war story, as the title is leading us to, the content, where do you begin, what's the subject going to be, comes back to this issue, or this question of who's writing it, and how does that matter in the world of the short story, and in the world of Edith Wharton's short story, it matters quite a bit. Other comments?
No, we don't know after we read this story whether I was a good writer or not. We don't know. Because I also agree the meta story is Edith Wharton writing about what are all the pressures against the voice of a war story being told, or the voice of particularly a woman's war story being told. And the pressures are, from the very beginning, the very first story that's published, poem that's published, is reviewed by the wife of a rector of a church, not by the New York Times poetry reviewer. Because it's a girl's poem, isn't it? It's graceful and ladylike tribute. Then it's reviewed by a man who says there's more than she knew in her poems. I know, she doesn't. And on through, you can go step by step through the whole story, but all the different blocks against this woman, and I'm guessing Edith felt the same blocks. People who know how the rules of writing a story, which then, because we're here, makes me think people know the rules for warriors coming back from war, and what you can and can't tell, how you should and shouldn't tell it. That's what this story says to me.
Right. So writing what makes up a war story.
Right.
It's evocative of that same kind of conversation that the editor was having.
Right. Because in the very end, Wharton writes that when finding this novelist says the story's wrong, she gasped, trying to readjust her carefully acquired theory of aesthetics.
So 259, yeah.
The rules of how you should write. Oh, yeah, sorry.
This is right, and I think even a few lines above it, he applauds the subject, right?
Yes.
Oh, it's puzzling. You've got hold of a wonderfully good subject, and that's the main thing, of course. But earlier in the story, we'd had something, her first conversation with the governess, right? Ivy tapped gently on the wrinkled cheek. Dear old Madsy, people don't bother with plots nowadays, right? Oh, don't they, darling? Then it must be very much easier, said Mademoiselle. But Ivy was not so sure on 250. So the question of what this subject matter is, and the irony in this story is, what's her subject matter? What's she writing about? What is the war story again in this? There is a war story in here. Be forgiven if we missed it. Whose war story is it?
Well, the Alpine Guards.
Oh,
Yeah. So at the end of all of this, right? Where does her story kind of start? Where does the Alpine soldier's story end? Where, what? Because we don't ever get to see. We don't get to read the war story itself. We just have this. It's about the act of writing it, of turning this subject into literature, right? Of turning another person's narrative, now removed twice, right, into a story that's suitable for critique, that meets the editor's preposterous requirements.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like it takes, what the governess has done is essentially realist, maybe nonfiction. This is what happened to this person.
Okay.
And then you get this kaleidoscope of everybody putting all these layers on top of what a war story should be, what it should contain, who should write it, who shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of what it's saying is this is getting distorted. It doesn't necessarily need to be realist or a narrative story that the novelist might come up with,
Mm-hmm.
but it needs to have integrity, right? It can't just be a Hollywood version.
Integrity is in true to the experience of the soldier, or integrity is in that the story needs to be a sort of coherent.
There needs to be some kind of authenticity of story. If you think of like Vietnam novels, there's animatic realist Vietnam novels and very realistic ones, but both of them can work on their own terms.
Right. We get a little preview of the kind of thing. We skipped over this passage today, but on 253, Ivy briefly talks about kind of what she does. The 2 or 3 paragraphs up from the bottom, Ivy decided to add a touch of sentiment to the anecdote, right, which is purely military, both because she knew the reader was entitled to a certain proportion of heart interest, and because she wished to make the subject her own by its original edition. So she's working through the sense of, so it's difficult to judge if the reader, if the novelist who was laughing at the story at the end finds the narrative, the war narrative, the subject preposterous, or these kinds of original sentimental touches that Ivy is sprinkled throughout.
Yeah, I think it leaves it almost ambiguous to understand like what are the components that made it not enjoyable. Is it the Hollywood recipe, or is it the lack of authenticity because this is not a story? Like, what is it about it? And is it just forced in general?
Or is it the photograph distracting everybody?
I think this entire story, like Edith Wharton's story, is also kind of making fun of what a war story is, and in that sense that whenever we hear a war story or we read a war story, we kind of become enamored by the image we create within our minds, and we don't necessarily think about the details or whenever there's been a failure within that story. I actually quite like that Miss Ivy's brain fails. Like, her story doesn't inspire the reaction that she wanted it to inspire, and instead everybody is enamored by her photo, because I feel like whenever we hear a war story, we become enamored by something that isn't necessarily what the story was going after.
I love that. That fits, I think, so nicely with the comment you made earlier about one of our expectations for these war stories is that they're going to be this sort of triumphant narrative, and then as the layers of irony in this thing, that even Ivy's narrative lacks triumph, right? That at the end of the day, that war, and maybe you could imagine it writing something like this, or reading something like this immediately in the aftermath of World War I, where what can you call, how could you call it a victory, right? It's a Pyrrhic victory, that there's so much just destruction all around that it feels it doesn't seem to do justice. I like that very much. It feels that there's a correspondence then between writing, between this story, between war itself, particularly the First World War. That's the ostensible subject of this. The photos. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about that because Wharton's story spends a great deal of time on the photo. Right? We get this sort of, let's see, whole moment on 257. Even, I guess it starts at the bottom of 256, where everybody is talking, and she thinks they're talking about her story. It just goes on and on and on. It's like 10% of the short story is this sort of where Wharton is setting us up for, oh, good, she's a success. It's going to be a triumph. They love her story, only to just destroy our expectations. It was evident not one of them had read her story. And the novelist too, the great man of letters, only wants the photograph at the end. What can we make of?
It's another idealized sentiment. The nurse who just wants to help the troops. It's yet another trope of war. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't talk about the women's devastation if their husbands are killed or anything else. So it's another layer. For me, it's another layer of irony.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like a Florence Nightingale kind of idealized imagery.
Right. Yeah. She's
the whole section.
Which is, I think, part of her own sort of assessment of the photo. Yeah.
Also, one thing that's just bringing up is that he's literally showing how women at the time were seen as objects, basically.
Mm.
Like they've been in all these point with nurses, with the warrior force. But at the moment he does this, he's not being recognized by for war poetry. So it can be a critique by Edith to all this option, like how women are seeing that era.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what she's bringing out. You can see like that was a reality at the time. So that's something important like to recognize now.
And she's working so much on the story, but yet none of it matters because nobody really read it. They're just looking at the photo.
I'm frustrated we had to skip over it, but on 252, Ivy herself also falls prey to this very thing, right? At the very bottom of 254, that when she first gets her hands on the review or the volume, she said, then she began to turn the pages of the review. She analyzed the poems. She read the Queen of Romania's domestic confidences, and she looked at the portraits of the authors. The latter experience was peculiarly comforting. The Queen was rather good-looking for a queen, but her hair was. And we watch Ivy, and this, Edith Wharton spares no one in her right, but she's falling into the same problem that we're going to find with the soldiers in the ward reading her short story. She's doing the same thing herself, right? Replicating.
And further to the point about the photo and the text, it's at the bottom of 253 where her reason for publishing it all, because she doesn't like what she's written. But then when she sees the photo's too good to be wasted. So exactly.
Yeah, right. The bottom.
And that's what comes back to her at the end.
Right. Really too charming to be wasted. What a line.
Too charming.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Right. So maybe as we're running out in the last couple of moments here, we could kind of wrap up a little bit. One of the things I guess maybe I really admire about this particular short story is the way that the war sort of sits everywhere and nowhere in it. That it's ultimately about writing, it's about experience, it's about one's, I don't know, expectations for the relationship between experience and writing. And I think we're going to see much more of that in the coming weeks. If you can come next week, we're going to stay in the neighborhood and talk about World War I and the Harlem Renaissance and the impact of the war on Harlem and the poetry that came out of here. I've included for the selections several pages from The Crisis, and I deliberately included some pages that just have advertisements and announcements in them. Please take a look at those too. I'd like you to read the articles if you can that are in there. I think, are we gonna, Dave, do you know if you'll be able to send that out, or if it's gonna go on a share folder or the file for next week?
We could do both.
Okay. All right. So look for an email from Dave, because it's kind of a large file size. But do try, like, even so when you start looking through those pages, you'll see some things that you might quickly want to glance over. Resist that temptation and devote some extra time, I think, to things that feel that we might initially suspect as being unimportant, because they might drive or create some interesting conversations and connections. I might bring a couple of extra poems too, but we'll read them in seminar. Thank you to everyone. We're at 7 o'clock, and I know that it's summer and there's lots going on and supposed to be, but I'm grateful for everybody's participation. Thank you for coming, for making the effort. I hope to see you next week if you can make it. If you can't, don't worry. Come the week after. Or whenever you're available. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Real quick, just a couple things.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know if you're all gonna.
Oh, no.